Today, we're going to explore another remarkable story in the Bible, the story of Queen Esther. This is a tale that has captivated readers for over 2,000 years, and remarkably, its themes remain just as relevant today as they were in ancient Persia. Before we meet Esther herself, we need to understand the world she lived in. The Book of Esther is set in the Persian Empire during the reign of King Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus, who ruled from 486 to 465 BCE. This was a massive empire stretching from India to Ethiopia, encompassing 127 provinces. The Persian Empire was the superpower of its day. The Jewish people were living in exile decades earlier. The Babylonians had conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and carried many Jews into captivity. When Persia conquered Babylon, the Jews were allowed to return to their homeland, but many chose to remain in Persia, where they had built lives and communities. They were immigrants, foreigners in a land not their own, trying to maintain their identity while adapting to a dominant culture. Our protagonist was born with the Hebrew name Hadassah, which means myrtle, but she would become known by her Persian name, Esther, which means star. This dual naming is our first clue to her complex identity. She lived between two worlds. Esther was an orphan. The text tells us that both her parents had died, and she was raised by her older cousin, Mordecai, who took her in as his own daughter. We can imagine what this meant for a young girl growing up without her biological parents, yet finding love and security in Mordecai's care. Mordecai worked as an official at the king's gate, a position of some responsibility in the Persian court. The text describes Esther as beautiful in form and appearance, but as we'll see, her story reveals that her true beauty went far deeper than the physical. The story takes a dramatic turn when King Xerxes, in a display of power and perhaps drunkenness, commands his queen Vashti to appear before him and his guests wearing her royal crown. When Vashti refuses, and we might see her refusal as an act of dignity and self-respect, the king is enraged. Influenced by his advisors, who worry that Vashti's defiance might inspire other women to disobey their husbands, the king banishes her. Now the king needs a new queen. So a decree goes out across the empire. Beautiful young virgins are to be brought to the palace so the king can choose a replacement. This wasn't a beauty pageant in the modern sense. These young women had no choice in the matter. They were taken from their homes and brought to the royal harem. Esther was among them. Mordecai instructed her not to reveal her Jewish identity, a decision that would prove crucial later. For an entire year, Esther and the other women underwent beauty treatments, a preparation period that must have been both luxurious and terrifying. They were being groomed for the king. When Esther's turn came, something remarkable happened. The text tells us that the king loved Esther more than all the other women. He placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen. A young Jewish orphan had become the queen of the most powerful empire in the world, yet she still kept her identity secret, as Mordecai had advised. Now we meet the villain of our story, Haman, the Agagite, whom the king promoted to the highest position in the kingdom. The king commanded everyone to bow down to Haman, but Mordecai refused. As a Jew, Mordecai would bow only to God. This religious conviction enraged Haman. But Haman didn't just want revenge against Mordecai. He wanted to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire kingdom. Think about the magnitude of this hatred. One man's refusal to bow led another man to plot genocide. Haman approached the king with a carefully crafted lie, describing the Jews as a people whose laws were different, who didn't obey the king's laws, and suggesting they should be destroyed. He even offered to pay an enormous sum into the royal treasury, 10,000 talents of silver. The king, perhaps not fully understanding what he was authorizing, gave Haman permission and his signet ring to seal the decree. Dispatches were sent to all the provinces on the 13th day of the 12th month. All Jews, young and old, women and children, were to be killed, and their property seized. Imagine the terror that swept through Jewish communities across the empire. One day you're going about your life, and the next day a royal decree announces your death sentence. the text tells us that while the king and Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. When Mordecai learned of the decree, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. Throughout all the provinces there was great mourning among the Jews. Esther, sheltered in the palace, heard about Mordecai's mourning and sent him clothes, but he refused them. Through messengers, Mordecai told Esther about the decree and urged her to go to the king to beg for mercy for her people. But Esther faced a terrible dilemma. She explained to Mordecai that anyone who approached the king without being summoned would be put to death unless the king extended his golden scepter, and the king hadn't called for her in 30 days. She was caught between two death sentences: the decree against her people and the law that might kill her if she approached the king uninvited. Mordecai's response contains some of the most powerful words in the entire Bible. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. These words have echoed through history. Mordecai was telling Esther that her position, her platform, her influence, these weren't accidents, they were purposeful. She had been placed where she was for a reason. After receiving Mordecai's challenge, Esther sent back a message that reveals her transformation from a passive participant in palace politics to an active agent of change. She instructed Mordecai to gather all the Jews in Susa to fast for her for 3 days and nights. She and her maids would fast as well. Then she uttered these famous words: "When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Esther had decided that some things are worth risking everything for. She would rather die trying to save her people than live safely while they were destroyed. After 3 days of fasting, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace. The king saw her. He extended his golden scepter, and she was allowed to approach. He asked what she wanted, promising to give her up to half his kingdom. But Esther was strategic. She didn't blurt out her request immediately. Instead, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet. At that banquet, when the king again asked what she wanted, she invited them to another banquet the next day. This built suspense and put Haman in a position of honor right before his fall. Meanwhile, Haman left that first banquet feeling on top of the world until he saw Mordecai at the king's gate, still refusing to bow. His rage reignited. His wife and friends suggested he build a gallows 75 feet high and asked the king's permission to hang Mordecai on it the next morning. Haman loved this idea and had the gallows built. That night, the king couldn't sleep. He asked for the royal chronicles to be read to him. As they read, they came across the record of how Mordecai had once uncovered a plot to assassinate the king. The king asked what honor had been given to Mordecai for this, and learned that nothing had been done. Just then, Haman arrived at the palace early, planning to ask permission to hang Mordecai. But before he could speak, the king asked him what should be done for the man the king delights to honor. Haman, in his arrogance, assumed the king was talking about him. He described an elaborate honor. The man should wear the king's robe and crown, ride the king's horse, and be led through the city by a noble prince who proclaims his honor. "Excellent," said the king. "Go and do this for Mordecai the Jew." The humiliation was exquisite. Haman had to personally honor the man he wanted to kill, leading him through the city on horseback, proclaiming his greatness. Afterward, Haman rushed home in mourning, his head covered. His wife and advisers now told him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." At the second banquet, the king again asked Esther what she wanted. This time, she was ready. She said, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated." The king was shocked. Who is he? Where is he? the man who has dared to do such a thing. Esther pointed at Haman, an adversary and enemy. This vile Haman. In the confrontation that followed, Haman fell on Esther's couch, begging for mercy just as the king returned to the room. The king interpreted this as an assault on the queen. One of the king's attendants mentioned that Haman had built gallows for Mordecai, who had saved the king's life. The king's response was immediate: hang him on it. So Haman was executed on the very gallows he had built for Mordecai. The irony was not lost on the original audience. The hunter became the hunted. The trap setter was caught in his own trap, reversing the decree. But the story wasn't over. The decree against the Jews was still in effect, and according to Persian law, a decree sealed with the king's signet ring couldn't be revoked. So Esther and Mordecai were given permission to write another decree, allowing the Jews to defend themselves. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the day they were supposed to be annihilated, the Jews throughout the empire were able to fight against their enemies and prevail. The Jewish people were saved, and to commemorate this deliverance, the festival of Purim was established, which Jewish communities still celebrate today, reading the book of Esther and celebrating their survival. So what can we learn from Esther's story in our contemporary world? First, Esther's story teaches us about the power of courage in the face of injustice. She risked everything: her position, her comfort, her very life, to speak up for people who were being targeted for destruction. In our world today, we face moments when we must decide whether to remain silent or to speak up. Maybe it's confronting racism or prejudice in our workplaces. Maybe it's defending someone who's being bullied or marginalized. Maybe it's using whatever platform or influence we have to advocate for those who have less power. Esther reminds us that staying silent may feel safer, but it's not neutral. Silence often benefits the oppressor. Second, the story addresses questions of identity and belonging. Esther lived with a hidden identity, caught between two worlds. Many people today can relate to this. Immigrants navigating between their heritage culture and their adopted home. People of mixed race or ethnicity. Anyone who feels they must hide aspects of who they are to fit in or stay safe. Esther's story acknowledges this tension and shows that sometimes revealing our full identity, despite the risks, is necessary for our integrity and for the good of our community. Third, Esther teaches us about the concept that theologians call providence. The idea that we may be placed in certain positions or situations for a purpose beyond ourselves. For such a time as this challenges us to look at our own lives and ask, what opportunities, privileges, or platforms do I have? What am I positioned to do that others cannot? How might my current circumstances, even difficult ones, be preparation for something meaningful? You might be a teacher who can influence young minds at a critical time. You might be someone with financial resources who can support important causes. You might simply be a person with a voice and a vote in a democracy. The question is, will you use what you have been given? Fourth, the story illustrates the danger of unchecked power and hatred. Haman's hatred of Mordecai escalated into a plot to destroy an entire people. This pattern, where prejudice against individuals becomes systemic oppression, has repeated throughout history. The Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Rwanda, the Rohingya crisis, and ongoing persecution of various groups around the world. Esther's story warns us to recognize these patterns early and to resist them before they become unstoppable. Fifth, we see the importance of community and collective action. Esther didn't act alone. She asked the Jewish community to fast with her. They were part of a larger community facing a common threat. Today, meaningful change rarely comes from isolated individuals. It comes from communities organizing together, supporting each other, and acting in concert. Sixth, the story demonstrates the value of strategic wisdom alongside moral courage. Esther didn't just barge into the king's presence and make demands. She carefully planned her approach. She built suspense and chose her moment. Courage without wisdom can be reckless. Wisdom without courage can be cowardly. Esther shows us how to combine both. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Esther's story is ultimately about hope. It's about how things can change, how the seemingly powerless can prevail, how justice can triumph even when the odds seem impossible. At the darkest moment, when destruction seemed certain, deliverance came. This has sustained Jewish communities through centuries of persecution, and it offers hope to anyone facing overwhelming odds. The story of Queen Esther invites us not just to admire her courage, but to find that same courage within ourselves to recognize our own such a time as this, moments, and to respond with wisdom, faith, and the willingness to risk something for what matters most.